Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sacker. The Eurozone continues to resemble an economic twilight zone. A land of no growth, debilitating debt, high unemployment and political uncertainty. By the end of the month, Greek voters may have demanded an end to austerity, which could prompt a new crisis of confidence. My guest today is Portugal's Secretary of State for Europe, Bruno Macaes. His country was bailed out and is trying to rebuild. But are the foundations fundamentally flawed? Bruno Macaes in Lisbon, welcome to Hard Talk.
Hi, Stephen. Great to be here.
We're in a new year, but I'm tempted to say same old problems for Europe. Would you agree with that assessment?
No. I was there in the European Council, and I think 2 years ago, January 31st, 2012. So actually, not 3 years ago. And you could see the tension, you could see how people were doubting what would happen the next day, and those days are over. And they're over not because of the movements in financial markets, because of what politicians in Europe did. So I think we're facing a fundamentally different situation now.
Really? You seriously think that the days of doubt in Europe, and in particular the Eurozone, are over, do you?
We're still going through a challenging situation, both in financial markets and foreign affairs and security, that's for sure. But you know, people tend to forget how difficult things were 2 years ago. This is all I'm saying. So we still have fundamental challenges, but the mood, it's confidence now, and I can explain why it's confidence, and it wasn't 3 years ago.
Well, you personally may be feeling confident. I think it's fair to say that many of your people are not, and they reflect upon your own Prime Minister declaring mission accomplished last summer when Portugal came out of the formal bailout programme, and they look at an economy which is still underperforming pretty badly, and they think that your Prime Minister was complacent, that he got it wrong.
Well, it was mission accomplished, not quite in the same terms as the other case we're thinking about. It was a cautious, careful statement, but still, you know, we remember how even 6 months before our program exit, everyone thought it was impossible. We heard that from everyone, and also in our own political debate. And then we did manage to get out of the program. We have the lowest yields in history, in our history, since we joined the euro. And so, you know, I think there's something to be satisfied about, even though, of course, you cannot turn a sort of a very heavy petrol ship around, which is a country, in a week or two or even a few months.
Sure.
But we're seeing some results.
Well, it would be daft to expect overnight miracles, and I'm not suggesting that I'm demanding that, but I am looking at the latest reports, for example, from the IMF and the ECB. Toward the end of last year, just a couple of months ago, the IMF expressing serious concern, saying that momentum towards greater external competitiveness in Portugal has flagged, greater reform effort is needed. ECB concluding that the pace of structural reform has diminished considerably. This doesn't suggest that Portugal is actually even going in the right direction at the moment.
It's not quite that. You know, those reports usually get sort of negative attention. It started, the report from the IMF, by saying how much we've accomplished in these 2-3 years. And then, of course, they want more. We want more. We have to see exactly how. The reports we're getting, for example, from the World Economic Forum say exactly the opposite, that we've been going up the international ladder very, very fast, 15 slots this year. The thing is, and you know, I'm sort of recent to politics, these things take time. And you're being very, you can't be a technician or a technocrat and don't understand that things in politics take a little long. And this is the way they're supposed to, if you want to sort of build a consensus.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say that. You know, you can't be a technocrat about this. You have to be political. I mean, actually, you are a technocrat. You know, you're not an elected politician. You sit there running Portugal's sort of Europe policy, but actually, you do it more as a technocrat than an elected politician. And so therefore it seems to me it's easy for you to say, look, you know, it's not easy, but we're heading in the right direction. But the fact is, when unemployment has started to go up again in your country, when youth unemployment is, what, more than 1/3 of all young people, and when your national debt is still one of the highest in the developed world at around 130% of GDP, politically, you've got a lot of problems there.
But let's look at the differences. 3 years ago, you would draw the debt trajectory over the next few years or even decades, and it would just be a curve going up with no end in sight. Now you draw the same curve and it's going down sustainably over the long run. And this is why we're paying the yields that we're paying. Unemployment, it's come down from around 17% to around 13%. All I'm saying is that sometimes from the IMF and from the European Commission, we get this idea that it can be done as quickly and as beautifully, as elegantly in an economic model. And you know, technocrat or no technocrat, coming from the university or not coming from the university, I know very well this is not how politics works. And if you try to do that, you're not going to be successful in politics. So look at the slow progress that we've been making. It cannot sometimes go faster than this. The important thing is that we're going in the right direction.
Interesting that you suggest to me that maybe the IMF and maybe the ECB too are sometimes unrealistic in the demands they place upon countries such as your own. Obviously, it's silly to look at Portugal in isolation. You're part of a big story inside the Eurozone. You must be looking right now at what is happening in Greece. The fact that by the end of this month, Greek voters may have conclusively rejected the austerity program they are supposed to be living under, and that must give you real pause for thought, no?
It does. And this is why we still have challenges in Europe. Well, you know, I don't want to comment in detail about the electoral process in Greece. It's 2 weeks to go, more or less. I certainly hope that we get out of the elections with a stable government. I certainly hope that Greece stays in the Eurozone. It's very important for Greece, very important for the Eurozone. But we'll have to wait and see. I think Greece as well has made some progress over the last few years. The thing is, critics sometimes don't understand where we started from. Where we started from 3-4 years ago. And sometimes we even didn't communicate that because we didn't want to alarm people and alarm financial markets. But it was a dire situation 3-4 years ago. Let's remember that.
All right, but let's talk a little more about Greece today. You say that you absolutely do not want to see Greece leaving the Eurozone, but it's a bit like a game of poker, isn't it? I mean, Syriza, if we're talking about the party which heads the polls right now in Greece, is committed to a fundamental renegotiation of the austerity conditions that it is currently living under. And if it sort of suggests if that can't be achieved, then Greece is going to have to do something pretty dramatic. On the other side of the fence, the Germans have said, well, you know what, if Syriza wins the election, we can pretty much assume that Greece will have to leave the Eurozone. You're saying that the Germans were wrong to make those noises, were they?
It didn't come from any senior politician in Europe, the noises that you're talking about, and I think it's a good thing that it didn't. Let's
hang on. It came,
too
as
much.
you well know, it came from senior officials giving guidance to a highly respected Der Spiegel magazine. So I think we can take it as read. The Germans want to send a very clear message that if Syriza is serious about tearing up the austerity conditions, Germany is not going to favour keeping Greece inside the euro.
Okay, here's the message that I want to send. I think we shouldn't dramatize too much. 80% of Greeks want to stay in the Eurozone, and Syriza, and I don't mind talking about Syriza, has said repeatedly that they want Greece to stay in the Eurozone. So although I'm not going to pretend that I don't know what is happening and that things are not tense, they are not dramatic to the point that you're describing them. And we have to wait and see. Until we have the election results, it's very difficult to make predictions. These are very complex scenarios. But here's the message. I really think that Greece is going to stay in the Eurozone. But I'm not going to say that there aren't any scenarios where Greece could leave. Of course, there are extreme scenarios that I'm not going to speculate about. They are very difficult to predict. But I think this is the balance that we have to keep in mind. So far, the process is under control. We can reach an agreement. But of course, there are scenarios where things could get out of control. I'm not going to hide that.
Well, and the question then is, what would the knock-on effect for a country like Portugal, still economically very fragile, what would the knock-on effect for Portugal be if post-election Greece, for one reason or another, is heading for that exit door?
I think the effect for the Eurozone would be, of course, negative, unpredictable to some extent. I am confident that Portugal has now overcome the most difficult moments. We see evidence of that every day. We see the evidence in our yields. We see evidence in the spread that we pay compared to German bonds. We see that, for example, in the stability of our financial system. Just went through a very rocky period and came out so far looking very, very stable. And so we're confident that the worst days are over and the resilience of the Portuguese economy will show if necessary. But of course, I certainly hope it's not necessary for that resilience to show within the next month or two.
Of course, and people watching our conversation will obviously think to themselves, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? Because he's Portuguese and he needs to keep the markets as calm as possible. But if I quote to you very influential figures from elsewhere in Europe, maybe the most important country, Germany, let's talk about a man who's been on my program not so long ago, Peter Bofinger, one of the members of Germany's Council of Economic Advisors. He says that, look, if Greece does head out of the euro, it will let a genie out of the bottle that will be hard to control. And that really is the truth of it, isn't it?
You know, I've been doing this for 3-4 years. I've seen so many theories that look perfect on paper, and then events were just much faster. Remember how Citigroup and their research unit were giving about 85% chance for a euro exit from Greece 3 years ago. So we have to keep calm. The thing is, of course I'm going to say this, but look at the evidence. Look at the fact that our financial system just went through a rocky period and it's stable. And even the economy is not showing any signs from that and from a bank resolution that we had 2-3 months ago. Look at our yields. Look that they're the lowest ever. So of course I'm going to say this, but I say it based on numbers and figures.
If I may say so, confidence is a very fragile flower. And in your country, you know, I think you're facing elections, in the autumn of 2015, and the opposition socialists are expressing deep unhappiness with the prospect of more cuts in your country, more austerity, and are saying they will oppose them, and the polls suggest the socialists stand a decent chance of winning the next election in Portugal. So the stability you're talking about and the way the markets view your country could flip very, very quickly.
Well, I think the political system in Portugal and the party system has also remained very, very stable through the process. Of course, we have our disagreements with the Socialist Party. We think that to a very considerable extent the crises we went through are due to the wrong choices that they made in the past. We hope they learn from it. But the thing is, every analyst looks at our numbers now and draws a completely different conclusion. In terms of course, the debt is very high. It's going to remain high for a long time. But the debt trajectory, the curve, the really fundamental curve, has a different direction now. It's going down. And this changes everything.
Yeah, but you know, I'm no trained economist, but I do know some sort of basic things. In an environment of very low growth in Portugal, I mean, next year and the year after, you're looking at perhaps 1% growth, very low inflation, sometimes we even talk about deflation. Your debt is not going to get much smaller anytime soon. In fact, it may well, as a proportion of GDP, continue to rise. Certainly that's what we've seen in Greece. And when you look at the facts, like, for example, you know, you pay more in your country to service your debt than you're able to spend on public education. You've got a profound debt problem, even if you have arrested, you know, much of your deficit problem.
We have a smaller debt problem than we had 3 years ago, and this is the crucial thing. Honestly, 3 years ago, you looked at the Portuguese economy. You saw an economy that hadn't grown for 10 years. You saw an economy that had never shown any willingness to reform, and you saw a debt trajectory that it was going through the roof. You look at it 3 years later, it's fundamentally different. You saw important reforms that were made. You see an economy that was able to grow even when going through fiscal consolidation, and you see that trajectory that is completely different. And it doesn't have to be you, Stephen, it doesn't have to be me, it's the people that are actually buying those bonds. They draw in completely different conclusions.
No, let me ask you something
and I
else.
think they're right to do it.
Yeah, let me ask you something else which is sort of connected. It's about the politics of this. When I talk to Greek politicians, even Greek politicians who still believe that austerity is inescapable and the right course to take, they are extremely alienated by many of the messages that come out of Brussels, but more particularly out of the Merkel government and out of Berlin. Do you think that Germany has mishandled the politics of turning the Eurozone economy around?
I don't think there was Germany turning the Eurozone economy around or trying to turn the Eurozone economy around.
But it's a German approach which has been adopted, is it not?
Not really. I think, fiscal discipline is something that I believe in very deeply, and I can explain why. If what you mean by a German approach is fiscal discipline, then it's my approach, and it's approach in many countries in Europe. And it's based on sound arguments. It's not a German tradition. So what do you mean by a German approach to the crisis? We have to establish that first. I don't think it was a German approach. And certainly in Portugal, it wasn't a German approach to the crisis. Of course, we get into real politics here. There's the center-right and there's the center-left in Europe. And my approach is a center-right approach, sure. And perhaps in Germany we have a center-right government. Perhaps an affinity there. But it's an affinity that, of course, has to do with a certain vision for the economy, whether you want to regulate it, whether you want to rely on public debt as a never-ending solution to every problem. Yeah, there's some real disagreements here. I hope the people in Europe have drawn the right conclusions, which is this left approach, socialist approach to economic problems doesn't work.
Well, you can look at
my conclusion.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you conclude that. Again, it comes to this point about political uncertainty hanging over Europe in 2015. There are many indications that a lot of Europeans draw a very different conclusion, not just in Greece. We've talked about Syriza leading the polls there. You can look at Spain, where the movement Podemos is now, it seems, significantly ahead in the polls. You can look maybe at Italy as well, where the opposition parties to the current government are all saying that they want a different approach to Italy's economic problems. You can look around the continent, and your confidence that Europeans share your view that this isn't about German dictating of policy, it's about people reaching logical conclusions, it doesn't match the evidence.
Well, this is also why I'm here, try to help shape that debate. I think fiscal discipline is a good idea. It's a good idea if you're worried about the welfare state, because you don't want it subject to all this uncertainty about whether the state can fulfill its obligations. It's a good idea for growth, because fiscal discipline forces governments to spend wisely and to invest wisely. So I really think fiscal discipline is a good idea. Other people in Europe have a different opinion. Okay, let's have a debate on that. I'm confident that I can win it, and that people agree with me can win it. Because also we look at the past, we look at what happened over the last 5-10 years in Europe. Lots of bad investment decisions by governments without any result when it comes to growth. And of course, very negative results when it came to debt.
Here's another, you use this word confidence a lot, and you come across as a confident sort of guy. But when it comes to the debt and your confidence that Portugal has turned a fundamental corner in terms of addressing the debt problem, the structural issues facing your country, and this is not just you, but it's a big European problem, are profound, not least because of demographics. The proportion of economically active people in your economy compared with those who are reliant on pensions and welfare, the ratio is turning in the wrong direction very dramatically. Soon, by 2050, I think, there'll only be 1.4 economically active people for every one who is dependent on pensions. How, given the added problem of emigration, many young economically active people leaving your country, how on earth is that going to be sustainable?
Well, this is a big challenge, not just in Portugal, all over Europe. Demographics is a big problem. We have to adapt to that. And this is going to involve some significant changes in our society, the way we organize our societies. I actually think demographic problems are sometimes sort of a canary in the mine. They show deeper problems with our societies and the way they're organized. So we have to think about this. We have to use technology. I don't think Europe uses technology enough. And also when it comes to healthcare for the elderly and so on. Immigration, this is a big issue. You're always going to have free movement in Europe. I mean, this is part of what we're trying to achieve in Europe, and I think it works.
Let me stop you there. With respect, some people say we shouldn't always have free movement in Europe. You know, British Prime Minister David Cameron wants to address that principle of freedom of movement. He wants to curtail it. Would you offer him your support for that?
This is not how I interpreted his speech. Not to curtail it, but of course we have to implement it. It's a principle, it's an abstract principle, then you have to implement it in practice. And it can take different forms. I didn't see it as curtailing it. I read the speech, Prime Minister Cameron's speech, very carefully, and I was happy to see that there wasn't really any suggestion there about curtailing the principle. There was lots of suggestions about how to implement it wisely. And I can disagree with some of the suggestions, I do. But the approach, that's the right approach. Not to curtail it, but of course to implement it.
Before we
it doesn't mean anything in abstract.
Right. Before we end, some quick questions that face Europe. Following on from what you've just said, one of the questions, never mind the Eurozone, is the future of Britain inside the EU. Does it matter to you as an influential voice in European discussions whether Britain leaves or not? How much do you care about that?
Care quite a lot. You know, the UK is our oldest ally. I also think the UK is a very positive influence in the EU when it comes to trade, when it comes to regulation, and lots of other issues. When it comes to foreign policy, I saw that over the last year, how influential and important it was to have the UK sitting there in the Foreign Affairs Council. And so I want the UK to stay. And I cannot imagine a Europe without the UK. It would be really tragic for us if that happened. But I don't see why it should happen. I really don't. I don't see any fundamental reason for that to happen.
Well, because on key issues, not least of which one is immigration, the British public are very sceptical about the worth of being inside the European Union.
Yes, but I'm still confident, that's that word again, I'm still confident that as you engage in this debate, it's going to become more and more clear that you're actually gaining a lot from immigration. That's the first thing to underline. And second, the immigrants from inside the EU in the UK are about 4% of the population. This number, first of all, is more or less the same in other member states. And second, it's much lower than immigrants from outside the EU living in the UK.
Okay.
So I'm a bit puzzled. I have to confess that I'm a bit puzzled why this has acquired this salience. And I hope that the debate from now on is going to stick to the facts and the figures a lot more.
Yeah, you in the past have talked about greater integration. You say there has to be an end to political fragmentation, implication there has to be a move to ever closer political union in Europe. I can tell you one thing, that doesn't go down very well amongst most politicians in Britain. Are you still serious about this notion of greater political integration in the European Union?
Again, it's a politician's answer. This depends how you think about it. I don't believe in a super state. I want to preserve national states. What I think is that there has to be more political dialogue between member states. For example, immigration. The way people look at immigration in the UK, in Portugal, in Germany, in Italy is so different. We run the risk of having completely different political cultures developing inside the EU. So we have to find a way, a very subtle, flexible way to encourage political dialogue. But certainly not a superstate in Brussels deciding for everyone. I find that idea very, very scary, just as people in the Conservative Party do.
All right, we have to end there. Bruno Macaes in Lisbon.
Thanks so much, Stephen.
Thank you for being on Hard Talk.
Thank you.